Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. My pile of tractor parts is really getting down there these days, and it really feels great to have everything ready to go when the motor comes back from the machine shop. Today I'm going to look at the rocker arm assembly and the oil pump, and we're going to take them both apart, inspect them, clean them, see how they are, and put them back together, so stay tuned. I got to take apart this oil pump and check everything. The way these operate is stupid simple. This is the pickup that sucks in oil out of the oil pan, and it floats so that it remains toward the top of the oil, because obviously all the sludge and dirt and whatever is going to settle toward the bottom of the pan. So this keeps the pickup up. And then the pump is in here. The oil that the pump pumps comes out here into the oil gallery. This is driven off of the crankshaft or the camshaft gear. So we'll check it out, see what it needs, hopefully just a cleaning, and check the clearances and put it back together. This pickup is just held on with a cotter pin through a slot in here, and that holds it in place. There's no play on the bushing on the drive gear off the camshaft, so that's a good sign. Take the bottom off. Typically there's a pressure relief in these, which is a spring with a valve at the end of it that relieves any excess pressure that the pump builds. I see them in all the gas engines, but this one doesn't have one. And that is really surprising. There's no machining for one. I thought this was the same oil pump as a regular M, but it's not. Like I said, these pumps are stupid simple. It's just two gears. One's driven by the camshaft. They rotate around and they run oil around the outside of them, and that's what builds the pressure. So you want to check the gears, you want to check the clearance to the cover. This is really tight. The tractor always held real good oil pressure, so there's a little bit of end play, but not very much. There we go. Man, compared to the smaller engines on the A, B, C, the H's, these pump gears are huge. They drive a lot of volume. All right, I checked the parts book on these, and the lack of a pressure relief valve is something that's unique to the diesel M's. The pressure relief valve's not in the oil pump where I would expect to see it, but it's in the oil filter housing, which we took apart in a previous video, and voila, there was the pressure relief valve. I wondered at the presence of two valves. Well, there aren't two valves. There's only one valve, and it's up in the oil filter. I'm not sure why they moved it from the pump to the oil filter, but that's the way it works on an MD. I'm going to clean this up in the parts washer, and then we can check things a little bit more closely. Boy, there's a lot of crud in this intake screen, and it feels like metal bits to me, and I suspect that's from pieces that came off of the piston and the top rings. Either that or it's really hard carbon from all that the engine had built up, and it's a bear to get out of these intake screens because they don't come apart very easily. This is the kind of stuff I'm getting out of that screen. If I had to guess, I would say they were shavings off the rings. I think I'd be better off popping this cover over the screen off so I can make sure I clean up the screen well. It's a first for everything. I've never had to take one of these off before. Look at all that. Wowie. Never seen one that bad before. Look at those big bits of metal. Yikes. Then on the cover, it's real gritty feeling stuff. Either hard carbon or bits of metal. I definitely know some of them are bits of metal because they're shiny. Now that I got the parts all cleaned up, there's a whole bunch of things I want to check. I am 99.9% sure this pump is just fine, but we're going to take a look. The first thing is the backlash between these gears. Now there's a measurement for this in the INT manual, but I just do it by feel. I didn't see anything that worried me as far as wear on the gears. they'll shine up on their wearing surfaces, but they're smooth. There's nothing to worry about there. So checking backlash is just a feel thing. The next thing I need to check is the clearance to the pump body, which is from the face of the gear out here to the shell of the body here. And the spec on that is that it should be 6 thousandths to 7.5 thousandths. This is 7 thousandths feeler gauge, you know, and it ain't even starting in there. So that's looking real good. The next thing we want to do is measure end play. And if you take and wiggle on the top here, see I get a little bit of end play. And the amount of end play that you have is what determines how thick of a gasket that you're going to use here. In my rebuild kit, gasket kit included 2 gaskets, and I put the calipers on these, and these are each 5 thousandths thick. So I think the idea is to stack them if you need to. But in order to determine what gasket I want on here, because this plate is what limits end play in the gears, I got to figure out what the end play is. So to do that, you have it all the way down on the end play. I can push it up, I can pull it down. So it's down, set it on the bench edge, put a straight edge across it, and the spec for end play is 3 to 6 thousandths. Let's try the 02, which is very, very thin. It won't slide under. And with the 02 on it, my straight edge rocks a little bit. So I'm guessing I'm at 001 or under without the gasket on. So the end play that I want is going to be including the gasket. So the gasket rides on here like this. And remember, this is 5 thousandths thick, this gasket. And then if I put the plate on, I'm adding 5 thousandths to the end play because of the thickness of the gasket. So this gear, even though it feels like it has very little end play, won't be able to go further in end play than where it's worn on here. And incidentally, this wear is just pretty much a shine. There's no groove at all in it. So I know that I'm fine using a 5 thousandths gasket because I know I have a thousandths or less protrusion of the deck of the housing above the gear. And so I'll have 6 thousandths or less when I put the plate on here, so it's within spec. 3 to 6 thousandths is the spec. It's a little complicated, but this is how a layman like me does this. Everything looks fine in this pump. I only need to use 1 gasket, and it's ready to put back together. Some people go to all kinds of great lengths to prime these pumps before they start up a new engine. I've never had a problem with old Farmalls getting the engine to prime when you start it up and oil makes its way through this pump. One thing I do is I take the idler gear out and I coat it good with engine assembly lube so that it gets that suction that it needs when it starts up to draw oil in. I just put plenty of it in there, and it'll work its way around the other gear and help to create a seal between the gears so you get suction on the pump at startup. So everything checks out just fine on this pump. I can go ahead and put it back together, put the gasket on here. One thing I never knew about these, because I'd never had a cover off, is that there's a hole in the middle. And that hole sort of seats onto this surface right here. It's a sort of relief if the screen gets clogged up. I think the screen will suck down from the action of the pump and then open up that hole in the center so the engine still gets oil, even though it might not be the cleanest oil once the screen is clogged up. There's another item off the list. I'll wait to hook this back in with a cotter pin until I get it in the engine. Seems like every video I do, I get a comment or two about why I'm not using that, the sandblast cabinet. And I do use it once in a while, but I prefer to use the grinder to clean off parts. Number one, because it's quicker. It's just quicker for me to grind clean parts, especially when I run into thick paint and grease. The grinder takes it right off compared to the sandblast cabinet. The second reason is for my workflow. When I'm using the grinder to clean off parts, there's usually a thin film of oil or grease that's still left on the parts the grinder doesn't take off. So I can put them in the parts pile and I don't have to worry about them flash rusting. If I were sandblasting every day, and I did the F20 sandblasting every single part, at the end of every day I have to prime everything that I sandblast or I worry about flash rust. So every day at the end of the day I have to clean everything up, hang all the parts up, and prime them, and it really slowed down my workflow. It's a lot quicker for me to accumulate all the parts and then move into the priming phase and do them all at once, and I don't have to worry about them flash rusting with the grinder, so it just makes a lot more sense to me. Next I'm going to take apart, inspect, and clean up the rocker arms, the push rods. I already cleaned up the valve cover and these little caps which go on the third valve in this engine to change the compression ratio. Normally I don't take these apart unless I find a problem when I'm checking them out for play, but this one's so heavily carboned up from blow-by that I think it's worth it to take it apart and look everything over. This one happens to be easy to take apart because there's just this set screw that goes in the end of each half, so I can take it apart and then slide the components off. When I take these apart, I keep the parts in order, so I disassemble them one at a time and clean them up and reinstall each rocker arm in the same spot that it was. I figure it's probably worn into the shaft in the correct way, and so I don't want to go mixing them up. Also on this assembly is the third valve actuator. So this rod underneath is the third valve. This connects to the linkage that's outside of the head, and the whole linkage assembly running back to the controls. There's 4 paddles on this that actuate, sit on the tops of these and push that valve down or let it up depending on the compression ratio and which way you're burning, gasoline or diesel. Push rods I don't keep in order. I'm just going to clean these off because when I set them back in the engine, I'm going to adjust the valve lash on each one. So it doesn't really matter if they're a little different. There isn't much as far as wearing in terms of the top or the bottom, just these little bearing surfaces, so they're fine to mix up. So we're going to work on this half first, take it apart and leave it in order. Okay. Well, I got all the pieces cleaned up, and one thing that was really noticeable is this actuator that depresses the third valve has been welded. That's an interesting place for a brake. It's held all these years, so I'm not that worried about it. I've got it all laid out in order here. Now the way that this whole assembly is lubricated in each end support, so at each end of the rocker arm assembly, the support has a hole in it for an oil feed up through the head. The oil comes up through here, comes into this space, and then from this space it comes into the bottom of this rod here, which is hollow, and of course the rocker arms are all on this rod. Oil fills up this rod and then drips through each of these ports into each rocker arm, and then each rocker arm has a groove in the bushing here that feeds the oil around it, and then when oil comes out and overflows, it comes up through this little itty bitty hole here, fills up this trough, and lubricates, just drips on the push rod on one end and drips on the top of the valve and the valve spring on the other end. A few things I noticed while inspecting the parts, you know, these are shiny where the rocker arms mount, but they aren't grooved, so I think they're okay. The only real grooves are where the ends of the springs have dug in, which really isn't that big a deal. But the real test is to put the rocker arms on one by one and see how they move and see if there's any play in them. So I'm going to start doing that. And I'm just using a little engine assembly grease on each one. So first it goes in the end mount. And the holes between the oil flow and into the rod here will line up automatically because the set screw in the middle of the assembly keeps it in the right position. there's one half. Now I'll assemble the other half. One other thing to check for is wear on these, and on the valve side, these rockers do have a little bit of wear where it taps on the top of the valve stem. It's not enough to really concern me. Again, this is a low RPM engine. I don't have a valve grinding set up to clean these up, and I'm not terribly worried about them. The other end, where it seats on the push rod, these ends are all nice. They don't show any wear at all on them. Right, now to put the two halves back together, and we got this third valve linkage underneath to deal with as well. It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Hopefully I don't have any pieces left over when I'm done. Yeah, that's lined up. Again. There we go. Then these 3 feet go underneath these 3 supports. Alright, now we can check the rockers since they're all sitting in the correct position now that the compression's applied on the springs. Check them for play in their normal position. There's very little, if any, play. This one has just a touch, and the rest of them, there isn't any play at all, so good deal. And for the push rods, all I do is roll them on a flat surface, and you can see whether they're bent at all that way. And these are all fine. There's very little wear on either end of them. They're all great. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pack the rocker arm assembly and the push rod in this plastic garbage bag, and I'm going to put them someplace safe, right next to where I'm keeping the carburetor, where they won't get knocked until it's time to install them. That went well. It was great to have 2 assemblies that only needed disassembly, cleaning, and inspection, and no new parts. They were both in decent shape. So I hope work continues that way for a while. We've had enough surprises, right? I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.